You're listening to Homeschool Connections, brought to you by the Homeschool Research Lab at the Johns Hopkins School of Education Institute for Education Policy. The Homeschool Research Lab aims to inform and influence evidence-based education policy by expanding access to homeschool data and conducting high-quality research. Through our Homeschool Hub and diverse collaborative efforts, we provide unbiased information, share rigorous academic studies, and translate findings into actionable policy insights that can ultimately benefit all students, including those that are homeschooled. I'm Christy Batts, a research fellow for the lab. In each episode, we'll dive into the latest research, data, and insights surrounding homeschooling. We'll dispel myths, inform stakeholders, and advance evidence-driven discussions. Today, we are here with Dr. Albert Cheng. He is a professor of education policy at the University of Arkansas and director of the Classical Education Research Lab. He is a prominent quantitative methodologist in the homeschool research field. Thank you for being with us today, Albert.
Hey, great to be with you, Christy. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course. I want to start with most of your expertise is in this classical education field. So tell us about the Classical Education Research Lab
Yeah.
and what is classical education?
Yeah. This is a lab here currently at the University of Arkansas in our department, Department of Education Reform. I started 4 years ago now because I'm interested in classical education. But in case you haven't heard, this is an educational model that's gaining in lots of popularity, lots of traction, and we just simply don't have any research or very little quantitative research about it. And so I jumped into the fray because of my interest. And, a lot of it's just to generate new knowledge about classical education, but also to come alongside leaders in the classical education space to support their work. It looks like they're doing a good thing. And so I decided to put some of my methodological chops to support that.
Tell us, what is classical education?
Yeah. So, how much time do we have? But I guess if you need the elevator pitch version, so I'd say a couple things. One, it's a model that is rooted in a long tradition that kind of transcends time and geography and culture. One which wrestles with perennial questions. Things like, what does it mean to be human? Who are we? Why are we here? What's the purpose of life? What's true? What does it mean to be morally good? How do I grow in virtue and wisdom? So these are big questions. And if we think of education broadly in that sense of formation, I think the classical tradition really tries to get at that. And one of the ways it tries to get at that is, as I alluded to earlier, it appeals to the tradition that people have asked these questions and wrestled with them for millennia. And so it is much about entering a conversation with a lot of these authors to answer some of these questions. So there's a variety of other ways to describe it, but we can get into it more.
Yeah.
But I think that's my little elevator pitch.
Okay, great. So am I correct in my assumption that classical education pedagogy is like, when I think about classical education, I think about primary texts, I think about Socratic methods.
Yep. Yep.
So I'm curious if any of your work in the lab is looking at the rise of AI around classical education.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. I actually haven't done any empirical research into it. I know this is a hot topic. Anytime there's a technological revolution, we all get thrown off balance and it challenges paradigms. You might say that classical education, the tradition, has wrestled with this as well. It's kind of well known, or maybe not so well known, that Socrates made an argument against the written word, oddly enough. And then his pupil, Plato, obviously thought differently, which is why we have lots of texts from Plato. And so even then, they're engaging with this issue. Is this oral tradition the way to go? And what's it mean for memory? What's it mean for instruction? And it seems, based off what we know, that even the two great kind of thinkers in the tradition, they disagreed. And so I think and you could say the same thing about the printing press, but one of the things in the tradition is that there is this North Star or grounding, if you will, in what's true and what's morally good, what's a life worth living. And we kind of think about what that means practically in terms of education. So these are fresh discussions that many in the movement are having. I haven't done any empirical work to speak to effects of this, or I actually haven't even done any descriptive work to track down, like, to what extent are schools wrestling with this, though I know others have. I mean, this is a fresh question, and you'll see folks wrestle with it at professional gatherings and conferences, and
Yeah.
someday someone's gonna have to do this work.
I appreciate you going into that. And another intersection that I think you have done a lot of empirical work around is classical education and homeschooling. What do we know about that
Mhm.
intersection?
So, yeah, I wouldn't say, scholarship-wise, there's a ton. If you're kinda familiar with the homeschooling world or the classical education world, for instance, Classical Conversations is a major homeschooling curriculum provider that takes a classical approach. And, yeah, we don't really have great estimates on the percentage of homeschooling families that use that. All we kinda know is that, look, Classical Conversations is a major publisher, and they're doing pretty well. And, broad network, broad take up. I have thought about ways to try to estimate this, and I haven't really come up with a great one. Maybe I'll figure one out someday, but I've definitely been asked by folks, certainly in the classical education movement, because, they're find them in all education models. So you've got them in the homeschool world. You've got private schools, religious or not, that use the model. You've got charter schools, a variety of charter networks that rely on the classical approach. And look, I mean, even some traditional public schools have vestiges of this in a lot of ways. Classical education was the way education was done. We have vestiges of that in the mainstream system as well, the predominant system, I should say. So there is this natural question of how much of classical education is represented by the homeschool world, and we don't have great estimates. I know of one estimate out there by Arcadia. They do have an estimate of the number of students, and it's escaping my mind right now, unfortunately. So I guess maybe all the listeners have to look up that report. It's in there.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting question. How many are using this method either formally or informally?
Right, right. And it gets at the challenge of measuring this, right? Like classical education, of course, it doesn't mean everything. There are definitely constraints around what it means. But at the same time, the way it's implemented in practice is actually quite large too. And so there is a challenge for how do you define it and then quantify the people that are using this approach. So there's already that challenge. And as you know, as a fellow homeschooling researcher, it's tough to get great data on the homeschool population. And this is doubly hard to then get good data to answer the question of what percentage of the homeschool population is using the classical approach.
Right, right. And so that's a caveat into what we don't know. What are some other things that you're curious about knowing about maybe the implementation of classical education and homeschooling?
Yeah, or I think one of the questions that interests me is what are the impacts of some of these different approaches? There's definitely value to the conventional 5 day a week model that we're all kind of used to in education. I mean, I'm on the board of a classical Christian school. It's amazing the community that they're able to form and the kind of instruction that they're able to give to their students there. I mean, it's just seeing kids lighting up, parents loving the kind of education they're doing. And then, down the road here in Northwest Arkansas, there's a hybrid model, a collaborative model where part homeschooling, part 2 or 3 days out of the week. And this school, educational community, or I don't know what word to use. They care about classical liberal education as well. And then, of course, you've got folks that homeschool full time, so to speak, and they're relying on classical conversations or some other model to develop that. And there are things that each model can and can't do by design, and it kind of raises questions about what are the implications for how formation happens for kids in these kinds of models, which I think is of close interest, right? If classical education is more about formation rather than just kind of dispensing information, right? Forming the soul, forming dispositions, forming tastes for truth and beauty and moral goodness. It raises an important question of how the way it's structured and these kinds of pedagogical practices, how do they then bear on those aims? And so I think that's an important question to wrestle with.
I am sure that you will figure it out because of some of your because of some of your prior work. Some of the things that you've published on are things about empathy and other values,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
And so at some point the data will catch up with
Yeah, yeah,
you
yeah.
and your interest.
Yeah, at least we know what rocks to, look under, and then we'll do our best.
You've brought this up a couple different times about values, and a lot of times when people think about virtues and values, they think about religious framework, especially in the education world. So,
Yeah.
I know you've done a lot of research in religious education as well. So, tell us about the intersection of religion and homeschooling, or maybe religion and classical education and
Sure,
homeschooling.
yeah.
Yeah.
Certainly for homeschooling, you're familiar with Van Galen's work, and other scholars have tried to describe the homeschooling population, and certainly a significant segment of the homeschool population. They do so for religious reasons, whether it's a position on the role of parents in educating and forming their students, all the way to homeschooling parents that don't have that full bore religious commitment about the role of parents, but hey, they want religious education. They want their kids to be exposed to good moral instruction and character instruction, and so they homeschool their kids for that reason. And so that's definitely a significant portion of the homeschooling population, but it's not all of them. You're familiar with the kind of the John Holtz tradition, folks that been kind of disillusioned and philosophically opposed to at least the way traditional school institutions are. They kind of feel it constraining, and so got to get out and take that more natural, child-centered approach that free of these kinds of artificial social constraints, so to speak. And then, as much as your work too, Christie, shows the kind of increasing diversity of the homeschool population, whether it's by race, ethnicity, it's beyond the kind of progressive or traditional religious framework as well. You've got families that are doing it for practical reasons, kids with disabilities and special needs, families that, post pandemic especially, there seems to be this cultural paradigm shift in wanting to emphasize the centrality of the home and the family and not do the kind of day in, day out rat race of driving your kids to school and this and that and wanting to support family life a bit more. And certainly just very practical concerns about like school safety and bullying. Yeah, it's definitely a different world, but segment of the homeschool population that does so for religious reasons, they're there and they're a significant segment. And I think you say the same about the classical education world. You've got look, classical doesn't necessarily mean a religious tradition, but fact of the matter is, in kind of Western civilization here, certainly in the U.S. And in Europe, but in the US, where most of my research is, classical does have roots in Athens. People read Aristotle and Plato, and they wrestle with Roman antiquity and Greek society, Greek civilization. And look, we're a product of that history, which you can say like Augustine all the way to Aquinas. I mean, these folks, in some sense, unified the tradition of Athens and Rome with uh, Jerusalem, and not just the Christian one per se, but even Jewish thought. So, and by the way, I don't know if listeners know that after the fall of the Roman Empire, it was the Ottoman and Muslim culture that preserved a lot of the ancient Greek and um, and Roman classical tradition, if you will. Before the surgence of uh, Christianity in Europe in the second millennia. There is a religious heritage and history there. Now, does classical have to be religious? I think this is one of the great debates in the movement. Can you have truth, goodness, and beauty without, say, a Judeo-Christian tradition? I mean, I suppose if you appeal to Plato and the non-Christian classical tradition, I mean, there is a answer there, right? It seems like there's a way to do it. And then if you ask certain folks today, some would beg to differ and say, like, well, no, it's truth, goodness, and beauty are rooted in the person of God. And so again, it's a hallmark of the classical tradition to wrestle with disputed questions. And I think you see a healthy, robust debate in the movement with this as well.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that thought process into this conversation. I do appreciate you disrupting that notion that it's only a Christian tradition, because a lot of people in the homeschool world are most familiar with classical conversations, which is
Mhm.
Christian
That's right. That's right.
pedagogy and curriculum. And so I appreciate you kind of bringing in other religious minorities, at least in the United States, that
Yep.
might be practicing classical home education in their particular religion as well, or outside of it.
Yeah, that's right. Susan Wise Bauer is a big name also in the homeschooling world, and I don't know that she would call her curriculum explicitly Christian at all. I just kind of know anecdotally. I again research, but
Yeah.
not that you need research to prove everything. You've got uh, Christian homeschoolers relying on her curriculum to provide some of the content, right, that they need. So yeah, it's definitely nuanced and we ought to pay attention to these distinctions.
Yes, if anybody has any ideas, especially how we can find distinctions within these populations so that then we can kind of like see what's working and what's not working. Go back to that outcome and impact question,
Yeah.
especially not just academically. Some of the work that you've done is on other outcomes as far as adult lifestyle, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, so this is a good caveat. You've published so much in the homeschool research world, and one of the most recent pieces that you published was about dosage, essentially.
Mhm, mhm.
Can you tell us about that study and what you found about adults that were homeschooled?
Dosage of homeschooling, or in other words, how much time does the amount of time spent in the homeschooling environment seem to make a difference for long run outcomes? And so this is work that was done with Angela Watson in partnership with Cardis. We obtained a nationally representative sample of U.S. adults, ages 24 to 39, and we uh, identified those that had spent at least 1 year homeschooling, and kind of divided the ever homeschooled adult population into three categories, if you will. Ones that we called short term homeschoolers who only did it for like a year or two, and then long term homeschoolers who did it for a majority of their K 12 education, and then kind of the medium term, which is the folks in between. And the thought there was to try to figure out ways to describe the population a bit more precisely. So there is, a kind of a perception of homeschoolers that, if you were a homeschooler, you must have done it for almost the entirety of your K-12 education, because aren't people who decide to homeschool doing so for philosophical reasons, whether they're like an unschooler or kind of a religious homeschooler? With some other data and reason, less well known research out there, we're finding evidence to challenge that. So in our data, for instance, we only found upwards to like 20% of ever homeschooled adults who did so for essentially all 13 years of their K 12 education. A third of adults who were ever homeschooled at some point did it only for a year or two. And so these adults at some point during their school age years switched back to either the traditional public schools or they went to a private school. And so that challenges this conventional wisdom of homeschoolers being this really unique segment where, wow, they're totally kind of disengaged or separate from other educational institutions. And so it seems it's just not true. So, with that in mind, the natural question is to ask, well, do these adults look different? I mean, shouldn't it be the case that if you were homeschooled for only a year or two, you should maybe look a lot more like a conventional traditional public school person? And then maybe if there are any differences between the homeschooling population and others, we should see that really pronounced in the long term homeschooled group. And essentially, that's what we've found. So that short term homeschoolers, I mean, there are a few differences here and there, but they generally look like folks who have never been homeschooled before. And then long term homeschoolers were the ones, if there were differences, were the ones that look quite different. It's kind of it's kind of uh, in the eye of the beholder whether the differences are good or bad. So on one hand, long-term homeschoolers were the ones that tended to have fewer years of education, so they were less likely to go on to college and get a BA. I think they were slightly less likely to be employed in the labor market, gainful employment, but of course, they're employed in other ways. Was told maybe you want to change that. It was actually a bunch of homeschoolers and homeschool parents, and a lot of them were stay-at-home moms. One of the folks in the audience said, maybe you want to change employed because we're employed in a different way. And I'm like, I get it. I'm at that life stage too, where my wife stays home with our young kids, and she's definitely employed.
Definitely working.
Yeah, definitely working. So, there's that. So if you impose this conventional economic framework that guides the way we evaluate outcomes, you might say long-term homeschoolers aren't doing great. What, they're making less money in the workforce. they're not getting a BA, and so they're not realizing the returns to education. That's bad, right? But then you take a wider lens and look at some other outcomes, things like some mental health indicators. So long-term homeschoolers look the best on depression and anxiety scales. So lowest levels of depression, lowest levels of anxiety. And it's actually only that group was had that difference. Short-term, medium-term homeschoolers didn't exhibit that difference between kind of the never homeschooled population. In a previous, I think it was like a 2014 iteration of the Cardis Education Survey, they found that religious homeschoolers seem to be more likely to agree with the statement that their lives seem to lack a sense of purpose or clear goals, which I mean that's something to really look into, like what's going on there. When we asked that question again this time, but if you divide out by dosage, long-term homeschoolers didn't look any different on that question than the non-homeschooled population. It was actually driven mostly by medium term homeschoolers. And now which raises the question of like, whoa, what's going on? Like, why them? Is this a fluke or is this for real? But I think there's something there. There's a separate question. It was I often feel helpless in dealing with problems in life. Consistent with what we saw with depression and anxiety, long-term homeschoolers, they disagreed with that statement. In other words, they felt like a real strong sense of agency and resilience and ability to deal with life challenges. So and they were more satisfied with life when we administered that questionnaire. Long-term homeschoolers more likely to do community service and volunteer, give charitably, more likely to be married and have kids. So yeah, it depends on what kind of like value proposition you assume in evaluating those results. And it's kind of unclear was more homeschooling bad or not? Economically speaking, maybe it's not as great, but then you look at all the other indicators, maybe it's better, right? And so which one would we prefer? But I think that data does then raise more questions about not only kind of dosage or the amount of exposure to homeschooling matter, but then once we identify and detect differences, we've got to have these other discussions about, is this good or bad? What are we rooting for here?
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I mean, I'm curious about the intersection of how many of those long-term homeschoolers had, a religious homeschooling experience. Is there some sort of interaction there, right?
That's right, that's
Yeah,
right, that's right.
so
Yeah, that's a
or
good question, and you might imagine you could ask the flip side, right? Like, imagine I mean, we don't have the data to ascertain this, but, certainly like the unschooler, side of things, I would assume that they they're more likely to be long-term homeschoolers as well, and so is it the unschooling or religious element of it, or is it just being in that kind of structure itself, independent of philosophical approach? So again, there's lots of questions that we have yet to answer, and we got to try to do the best we can.
That's right. So you've mentioned some of the quantitative data sets that you've been able to work with, like that Cardis survey that is regularly administered through different years. But what is available for homeschooled quant data?
That's tough. The U.S. Department of Education, they're at the National Center for Education Statistics. They had lots of survey programs. Unfortunately, that's kind of up in the air. You were chomping at the bit to see what the 2023 National Household Education Survey data what that would look like, and then that data was never released, at least
Yeah.
of this recording. So certainly some of the federal government data sets that we relied on a lot. Uh, I don't know that we have more recent iterations of that, which I think, all right, there are some other efforts. And so certainly Cardis has been one to be intentional about trying to get data about homeschooling. And I know homeschooling researchers too. A lot of times we bootstrap our own samples. I know homeschooling research tends to get critiqued for, oh, you just relied on a convenience, non-representative sample, and I get it, I get it. But at the same time, we're bootstrapping here to try to say something. Otherwise, we're not saying anything, at least kind of systematically that way. So I think there's that. I know I've used the Understanding America study quite a bit based out of USC. The American Life Panel, I think, is going to have some stuff. At least in contemporary time or current moment we're in, it's going to be a lot of raising your own convenience samples. or raising some funds and resources to contract with firms that can get you nationally representative data. So that's what we rely on these days.
Yeah, I appreciate you giving us a lay of the land as far as quant data. Something that the Homeschool Hub relies on a lot is participation rates from what
Yep.
states collect.
Yeah, yeah. Right. So I think like certain state agencies, education agencies varies, but some have great systems where you can do some of this work as well.
I want to go back to some other studies that you've conducted. You've just done so many interesting ones. I kind of wanted to give you a moment to talk about the most memorable one that you've done and why.
Why is that most memorable? So I think it was my first peer-reviewed pub. I guess you never forget that one. And my first one happened to be one on homeschooling, and so I'd say for that reason, it's most memorable. Right? It's the one where I mean, talk about bootstrapping your own sample. I had a connection at a to a small Christian university and realized that oh, that's a student population where I'm sure you could get a decent number of people that had been homeschooled. So I still remember working with a professor there to get some students to administer some surveys. And so this one was a study on a civic outcome, political tolerance, and surprised me. I mean, we still debate this today, right? So homeschoolers, because they, in some sense, pull back from one of the main civic institutions in U.S. society, i.e., the kind of conventional public school system, are they going to be less well formed as citizens. And so in this one, we looked at political tolerance, and we found the opposite. And so we more years of homeschooling seem to be correlated with greater levels of tolerance, kind of understood as support for liberal values and liberal society, and letting others with whom you disagree exercise their rights, to protest and petition. Which, by the way, I don't want to make it sound like the philosophical debates and theoretical debates one sided. I mean, there's a robust literature making the argument that homeschooling is good for forming citizens, and maybe just to circle all the way back to the beginning, John Locke and even Jean Jacques Rousseau made this argument. They were worried about the negative peer pressure that you would get from other students in school. They're worried, in their words, about fashion and opinion that would undermine good formation in Locke's case, in virtue, and for Rousseau, I guess a form of virtue, but his was kind of it would undermine your authentic self. And so, hey, this is an issue we've wrestled with for at least 600 years, or no, I'm doing my math wrong.
Yeah.
400.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, uh, uh, yeah, so that's my most memorable study.
That's a great circling back, and I remember reading that paper when I first got into this field and being impressed with your methodologies, and also, even if it was bootstrapping, like, this is a creative way, right? Well, what projects are you excited about right now?
The most exciting one is forthcoming, so stay tuned in the summer. So this is a project that I'm working on with the Society for Classical Learning, one of the largest classical school associations, classical Christian in the States here. We've got a kind of long run outcome study of classical education. So we're doing similar to what we did with the Cardis data, nationally representative sample of adults. This time, we have a measure of kind of exposure to classical education, classical pedagogy, and we are measuring a whole slate of outcomes. So stay tuned in the summer. We've found some interesting things.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm very curious. I will definitely, keep an eye out for it, and we'll definitely.
We got homeschool data there too, speaking of which. So, and I've yet to dig into that. So which actually, wow, I didn't think about this. That might actually be a way to estimate the size of the classical homeschooling population, because we have indicators of all that.
Look at that.
Wow, amazing what conversation can do, right? Just give you good ideas.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah,
Okay, good. Yeah. Well, put it on your to-do list. Single out that variable and see what
yeah.
there is. More to come on the more to come, right? Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
It's been my pleasure, Christy. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for joining us for an episode of Homeschool Connections. For more resources, research, and data, connect with us on social media at JHU Homeschool or visit us online at education.jhu.edu/edpolicy, where you can click through to explore the Homeschool Hub and scroll down to sign up for our newsletter. If today's episode sparked ideas or questions, we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, I'm Christy Batts with the Johns Hopkins Homeschool Research Lab.